The small town of Bolingbrook, Illinois, nestled just outside Chicago, wore a mask of tranquility. It was the kind of suburb where neighbors waved as they mowed their lawns, children played basketball in driveways, and everyone felt they knew each other's lives. Behind the picturesque facade, however, the Peterson family harbored secrets that would soon shatter that peace forever. Drew Peterson was a name everyone recognized. A decorated police sergeant with decades of service, Drew was known for his charm, his sharp wit, and his larger-than-life personality. At 53, he was an authoritative figure in Bolingbrook, someone people turned to in times of crisis. But within the walls of his neat brick home, his marriage to Stacy Peterson, his 23-year-old wife, was not as picture-perfect as it seemed. Stacy, vibrant and young, was the mother of 2 small children, Lacey and Anthony. She had an infectious laugh and an easy smile, though in recent months those smiles seemed strained. Friends and neighbors noticed she was quieter, less eager to engage. She often avoided eye contact, and her cheerful energy dimmed. People chalked it up to exhaustion or stress. Raising children was no easy task, but those closest to Stacy knew something wasn't right. Drew, ever the watchful husband, started to notice too. At first, he dismissed it as overthinking. Stacy had always been the heart of the household, managing the kids, the meals, and the errands. But small things started to gnaw at him. A glance that lingered too long on her phone, hushed conversations she quickly ended when he walked into the room, or the way she pulled back when he reached for her hand. Something had shifted. One crisp October evening, Drew noticed Stacy's phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. She wasn't in the room. His eyes flicked to the screen, a name he didn't recognize. Curiosity and unease churned in his stomach as he picked up the phone. The message was short, just a few words, but they hit him like a punch to the gut. "Can't wait to see you." Stacy walked in, saw Drew holding her phone, and froze. Her wide eyes and the flush that crept across her face confirmed what Drew already felt deep down. She grabbed the phone, her voice sharp. "Why are you looking at my messages?" His response was quiet, controlled, too controlled. "Who's this?" he asked, pointing to the name on the screen. Stacy didn't answer. Instead, she shook her head, muttered something about privacy, and left the room. Drew stood there, staring after her, a strange mix of betrayal and fury bubbling beneath the surface. Over the next few days, Drew became more vigilant. He began observing Stacy more closely, picking up on every little inconsistency in her stories. She was coming home later, claiming she'd run into a friend at the store, or had to grab a last-minute item for the kids. She was on her phone more often, stepping outside to take calls that she whispered through the cool autumn air. The tension in the house grew palpable. The children, innocent to the undercurrent of hostility, continued their routines, while Drew and Stacy drifted further apart. At night, Drew lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every interaction, every clue, every possibility. Was it all in his head? Or was the woman he adored hiding something far darker than he ever imagined? Stacy sat on the edge of the couch, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. Across the room, Drew leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded, his eyes locked onto her. The silence between them was thick, weighted with unspoken accusations and unanswered questions. The tension had grown unbearable since the moment Drew had seen that text message. For him, the words weren't just a betrayal. They were a crack in the foundation of the life he thought he had built. "What's going on, Stacy?" Drew's voice was low, almost calm, but the calmness was a mask. Underneath, there was a storm brewing. "Are you going to tell me who he is?" "There's no one," Stacy replied quickly, her voice shaking. She didn't meet his eyes. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" Drew's tone sharpened. He pushed off the counter, stepping closer, and Stacy instinctively recoiled. "Then what is it? Because I'm struggling here, Stacy. Help me understand why you've been acting so distant." Her response came slowly, almost inaudibly. "I just need space, Drew, that's all. I need to figure things out." "Space?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "We're married, Stacy. You don't just get to need space. We have a family, a home. You don't walk away from that." But the truth was, Stacy had been trying to figure things out for months. She had long since realized that the man she married was not the man she thought he was. The charm Drew displayed in public was a facade. Behind closed doors, he was controlling, demanding, and quick to anger. She had seen glimpses of that darkness before, but after their wedding, it became impossible to ignore. Her sister Cassandra had been her lifeline. Stacy often confided in her, though she was careful not to reveal too much. Drew's temper wasn't just frightening, it was unpredictable. "He watches everything I do," she told Cassandra during one of their late-night phone calls. "It's like he's always waiting for me to slip up." That feeling of being watched intensified after the argument about the text message. Drew became more vigilant, scrutinizing every move Stacy made. If she left the house, he wanted to know where she was going, who she would see, and how long she would be gone. And when she came home, his questions were relentless. One evening, Stacy returned from the grocery store to find Drew sitting at the dining table, her phone in his hand. "You forgot to take this," he said, holding it up. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd keep it safe for you." Stacy's breath hitched. "You went through my phone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just making sure my wife isn't keeping secrets from me," he replied smoothly. But his words carried an edge, a warning she couldn't ignore. Stacy turned and walked away without another word. In the bathroom, she locked the door and sank to the floor. Tears blurred her vision as she pressed her palms against her temples. This wasn't the life she wanted. This wasn't the man she thought she had married. She had considered leaving before. The thought of packing up the kids and driving away haunted her in moments like this. But Drew was a police sergeant. He knew how to find people, and he had made it clear time and time again that he wouldn't let her go easily. The next morning, Stacy sat across from Pastor Neil Shorey at a small coffee shop. She spoke in hushed tones, her hands trembling as she stirred her drink. "He told me he killed her," she said finally, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Pastor Shorey froze. "Who? Who did he kill?" "His ex-wife, Kathleen," Stacy replied, her voice barely audible. "He said it was an accident, but I don't think it was, and now I think he might do the same to me." Pastor Shorey felt a chill run down his spine. Stacy's fear was palpable, and her confession opened a door to a past he hadn't known existed. "Have you told anyone else?" he asked carefully. "No." Stacy shook her head. "And I don't think I can. He's always watching. He'll know." In the quiet hours after her meeting with Pastor Neil Shorey, Stacy sat alone in her car, staring at the dashboard. The weight of her confession lingered heavily in the air. Drew had told her about Kathleen Savio's death. The chilling nonchalance in his voice was something Stacy would never forget. The memory of that moment haunted her, as did the growing realization that she might be next. Years before, Kathleen's death had been the talk of Bolingbrook. Drew's third wife had been found dead in her bathtub in March 2004, mere weeks before their divorce was to be finalized. At the time, it was labeled a tragic accident, but whispers of something darker had persisted, whispers that were now clawing their way back to the surface. Back then, Drew had seemed untouchable. A respected police officer with connections, he quickly dismissed any suspicion. "She slipped," he told investigators. "We weren't even together anymore. Why would I have anything to do with this?" And for a while, people believed him. After all, Kathleen had no obvious enemies, and Drew's demeanor was calm, almost rehearsed. But Kathleen's family never accepted the ruling. Her sister, Susan Doman, remembered how Kathleen had described Drew in the weeks before her death. "If I die," Kathleen had said, "it won't be an accident. It'll be Drew." The chilling words replayed in Susan's mind as she pushed authorities to dig deeper, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. For years, Kathleen's death was just another closed case, buried in paperwork and bureaucracy. Stacy, however, knew the truth, or at least Drew's version of it. One evening, during one of their rare quiet moments, Drew had let something slip. He was unusually candid, almost smug as he described his past. "Kathleen always knew how to push my buttons," he said. "She thought she could take everything from me. She was wrong." "What do you mean by that?" Stacy had asked cautiously, her voice trembling. Drew looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Let's just say she had her chance to walk away, and she blew it." Now, sitting in her car, Stacy replayed that conversation in her mind. She had dismissed it at the time, convincing herself that Drew was just venting his frustration. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how calculated his words had been. He wasn't venting, he was bragging. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was Cassandra. Stacy hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hey," she said, trying to steady her voice. "You sound off. Are you okay?" Cassandra's concern was immediate, her tone sharp with worry. "I'm fine," Stacy replied, though the quiver in her voice betrayed her. I don't know what to do anymore." "Get out of there, Stacy," Cassandra urged. "You've said it yourself. He's dangerous. You need to leave." "It's not that simple," Stacy whispered, her gaze darting to the rearview mirror as though Drew might appear at any moment. "You don't know what he's capable of." Cassandra's voice softened. "Then let me help you. You don't have to do this alone." Stacy wanted to believe her sister, to cling to the hope that she could escape. But Drew was always one step ahead. He knew where she went, who she talked to, even the thoughts she didn't dare say aloud. How could she leave when every move she made was under his watchful eye? The next day, while Drew was at work, Stacy found herself rummaging through his home office. She wasn't even sure what she was looking for. Proof, maybe, or something to confirm her fears. What she found instead stopped her cold. A stack of old documents from Kathleen's case. Police reports, photos, even autopsy results, all meticulously organized in a folder with Drew's handwriting scrawled across the top. Resolved. The air in the room seemed to thicken. Stacy stared at the folder, her heart pounding. Why would Drew keep these? What was he trying to hide, or worse, protect? Stacy didn't have time to process her discovery. The sound of the garage door opening sent a jolt of panic through her. Drew was home. Quickly, she shoved the folder back into the drawer, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. When Drew walked in moments later, his gaze lingered on her for just a beat too long. "Everything okay?" he asked casually, though there was an edge to his voice. "Yeah," Stacy lied, forcing a smile. "Just cleaning up a little." Drew didn't respond. He simply nodded and walked past her, but Stacy could feel his suspicion lingering in the air. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. The question now was how much Drew suspected, and how much time she had left. The sun was just beginning to rise over Bolingbrook on October 28, 2007, casting soft light across the quiet streets. Inside the Peterson home, it was unnervingly silent. Stacy had been awake for hours, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't silence. The conversation with Cassandra the night before echoed in her head. "You've said it yourself. He's dangerous. You need to leave." But how could she? Drew was always watching, always calculating. If he even suspected she was planning to leave, the consequences could be devastating. Stacy sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of her. She stared out the window, the autumn leaves falling in slow spirals, but her focus was elsewhere. Drew had been acting strangely the past few days, more intense, more controlling. The air between them felt suffocating, and Stacy knew something had shifted. She couldn't pinpoint when, but his suspicions had clearly deepened. Upstairs, Drew stirred in bed. His instincts, sharpened by years as a police officer, told him that something wasn't right. Stacy had been distant, avoiding eye contact, her answers clipped and evasive. He hated it, hated the feeling of being shut out of his own home. When he finally rose and walked downstairs, he found Stacy still sitting at the table, lost in thought. "You're up early," he said, his voice neutral but probing. Stacy flinched slightly, startled by his presence. "Just couldn't sleep," she replied, trying to sound casual. Drew studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "Anything on your mind?" She shook her head quickly. "No, just thinking about errands I need to run." He didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. Drew poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements deliberate, as if each step was part of an unspoken game. Stacy felt her pulse quicken. She needed to get out of the house, even if just for a moment to clear her head. "I'm going to take a quick drive," she said suddenly, standing up and grabbing her keys. "I need some fresh air." "Where to?" Drew asked immediately, his tone sharp. "Just around," Stacy stammered. "I'll be back soon." Drew watched her carefully, but after a beat, he nodded. "Be quick." The drive felt like a reprieve. Stacy gripped the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts spiraling as she drove aimlessly through the quiet streets. She thought about Cassandra, about Pastor Shorey, about Kathleen. The weight of everything was crushing. She knew she had to make a decision, but fear paralyzed her. When she returned home, Drew was waiting for her in the living room. His posture was tense, his arms crossed over his chest. "What's going on, Stacy?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "You've been acting strange lately." "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know?" Drew stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You disappear without telling me where you're going. You're hiding something. So, let's try this again. What's going on?" The confrontation sent Stacy into a panic. She muttered something incoherent and fled upstairs, locking herself in the bathroom. Her heart pounded as she tried to calm herself. She couldn't keep living like this. Every day felt like a battle for survival. That night, Stacy tucked the kids into bed, lingering in their rooms longer than usual. She kissed them goodnight, whispering soft reassurances, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to comfort more, them or herself. When Drew finally went to bed, Stacy remained downstairs. She paced the living room, her mind racing with possibilities. Could she leave tonight? Should she? But the thought of Drew waking up and finding her gone sent chills down her spine. She decided to wait, telling herself that tomorrow might bring more clarity. But tomorrow never came. By the time the sun rose again, Stacy was gone. Drew claimed she had left voluntarily, taking nothing but her purse and abandoning their children. He called a neighbor later that morning, nonchalantly asking if they'd seen Stacy. "She's probably just blowing off steam," he said casually. But even as the words left his mouth, Drew's expression betrayed something else, an emptiness, a coldness that sent shivers through those who saw it. The morning after Stacy's disappearance, the Peterson home was eerily quiet. Drew moved through the house with the calm precision of someone preparing for a busy day. He checked the locks on the doors, glanced briefly at the kids as they played in the living room, and walked into the garage. There, nestled in the corner, was a large blue plastic barrel, its presence unassuming but ominous. Across town, Cassandra Cales, Stacy's sister, was frantic. She had called Stacy repeatedly the night before, her calls going unanswered. It wasn't like Stacy to ignore her. By mid-morning, Cassandra was at the police station, reporting her sister missing. "Something's wrong," she insisted, her voice trembling. "She wouldn't just leave her kids. Not like this." Police officers arrived at Drew's home that afternoon to ask questions. Drew greeted them with a composed smile, his demeanor unnervingly casual. "Stacy left," he said simply. "She wasn't happy. Said she needed time to herself." The officers pressed him for details. "Did she say where she was going? Did she take anything with her?" "She took her purse," Drew replied with a shrug. "That's it. Look, she's done this before. She always comes back." But something about Drew's tone didn't sit right with the officers. It wasn't just what he was saying. It was how he was saying it. Too calm, too indifferent. One of them noticed the faint smell of bleach wafting from the garage. As the investigation unfolded, neighbors began coming forward with accounts of strange activity at the Peterson house. One neighbor reported seeing Drew struggling to load something heavy into his SUV late that night. "It looked like a barrel," the neighbor said. "A big blue one." This detail sparked immediate interest among investigators. A blue barrel? It was an odd item for someone to be moving in the middle of the night, especially given the timing of Stacy's disappearance. Things took a darker turn when Thomas Morphy, Drew's stepbrother, came forward. He was visibly shaken, his voice cracking as he recounted the events of that night. "Drew asked me to help him move something," he said. "He didn't say what it was, but it was a blue barrel. It felt heavy, too heavy." Thomas's confession sent shockwaves through the investigation. He explained how Drew had called him late that evening, insisting he needed help with an urgent favor. When Thomas arrived, Drew was waiting in the garage. The blue barrel was already sealed. No explanation was given, only a quiet, unspoken understanding that this was something Thomas shouldn't question. "I didn't ask what was in it," Thomas admitted, his hands trembling. "I didn't want to know." Later that night, overcome with guilt and fear, Thomas attempted to take his own life. He survived, but his actions spoke volumes about the weight of what he suspected. Investigators now had their first tangible lead, a connection between Stacy's disappearance and Drew's inexplicable actions. The next step was clear. Police obtained a warrant to search Drew's home and garage, but when they arrived, the blue barrel was gone. Drew watched from his driveway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, as officers combed through his property. "Find what you're looking for?" he asked, his voice laced with thinly veiled sarcasm. Inside, investigators found bleach-stained rags and traces of what appeared to be a cleanup effort, but without the barrel, the evidence was circumstantial at best. It was a frustrating dead end, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. As word of the blue barrel spread, the media descended on Bolingbrook. Reporters camped outside Drew's home, their cameras capturing every movement. Drew, ever the showman, seemed to relish the attention. He smirked at the cameras, even waving to reporters as they shouted questions at him. His behavior only fueled public suspicion. Neighbors, once supportive, began to turn against him. "He's hiding something," one neighbor said during a televised interview. "Nobody acts like that if they're innocent." The blue barrel had become a symbol of the mystery surrounding Stacy's disappearance, a grim reminder that the answers everyone was searching for might be closer than they thought. But as days turned into weeks, Drew's composure never cracked. He maintained his story, insisting Stacy had left on her own accord. But the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. And for investigators, the hunt for the blue barrel, and the truth it might contain, was just beginning. In the wake of Stacy's disappearance, the whispers surrounding Drew Peterson grew louder. While neighbors and the media speculated about Stacy's fate, investigators shifted their focus to a name from Drew's past: Kathleen Savio, his third wife. Kathleen's death had been ruled an accidental drowning years earlier, but under the shadow of Stacy's vanishing, the case demanded a second look. Kathleen's family had never accepted the official ruling. Susan Doman, Kathleen's sister, had repeatedly insisted that Drew was involved. "She told us," Susan said in an interview. She said, "If anything happens to me, Drew did it. We tried to warn the police, but they didn't listen." The evidence from 2004 was damning even then. Kathleen's body had been found in a dry bathtub, her head resting at an unnatural angle. Bruises mottled her skin, and there was blood on her scalp. The coroner noted these details, but the conclusion, an accident, stood unchallenged, bolstered by Drew's influence within law enforcement. Now, with fresh scrutiny on Drew, the Illinois State Police obtained a court order to exhume Kathleen's body. It was a controversial move, one met with resistance from Drew's defense team. "This is nothing more than a witch hunt," Drew's lawyer declared in a press conference. But investigators pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. When Kathleen's body was exhumed, forensic experts conducted a second autopsy. The findings were chilling. Dr. Larry Bloom, a prominent forensic pathologist, concluded that Kathleen's injuries were consistent with a struggle, not a fall. Her wounds included a deep laceration on the back of her head and extensive bruising around her torso, injuries that were impossible to reconcile with the idea of a simple slip in the tub. The most critical revelation came from the pattern of her bruises. "These aren't the kind of injuries someone would sustain from falling," Dr. Bloom explained. "They indicate she was held down, perhaps even struck." The conclusion was clear. Kathleen Savio had been murdered. As this information came to light, Drew's facade of calm began to crack. During an interview with a local news outlet, his answers grew evasive, his signature smirk replaced by a defensive edge. "They're trying to smear me," he said, his tone biting. "Kathleen's death was an accident, everyone knows that." But the evidence told a different story. Investigators discovered new documents among Kathleen's belongings, letters she had written to a friend describing Drew's threats. In one particularly chilling passage, Kathleen wrote, "He said no one would believe me if I accused him. He said he could make me disappear, and no one would ever know." These revelations reignited public interest in the case. Bolingbrook, once a quiet town, became a media circus. Protesters gathered outside Drew's home holding signs demanding justice for both Kathleen and Stacy. Drew, unshaken, continued to maintain his innocence. He often waved at the cameras as he left his house, his demeanor infuriating those who sought the truth. Kathleen's family, however, saw the exhumation as a vindication. For years they had fought to have her case reopened, and now they had the evidence they needed. "We always knew," Susan said through tears during a press conference. "We just needed the world to see it too." With the findings from Kathleen's autopsy in hand, prosecutors began building their case against Drew. They pieced together a timeline of Kathleen's final hours, supported by witness statements and forensic analysis. One neighbor recalled hearing a loud argument from Kathleen's house the night she died. "It was bad," they said. "Lots of yelling, lots of banging. Then it just stopped." Despite mounting evidence, Drew remained free, his charm and connections insulating him from immediate arrest. But for investigators, the picture was becoming increasingly clear. Drew Peterson wasn't just a suspect in one disappearance. He was now the prime suspect in a murder. As the media storm raged on, Kathleen's voice, once silenced, spoke louder than ever through the evidence. Her body, her letters, her cries for help painted a harrowing picture of a life lived in fear. And for the first time in years, it seemed that justice might finally be within reach. The quiet town of Bolingbrook, Illinois, had once embraced Drew Peterson as one of its own, a decorated police sergeant with a reputation for integrity and dedication. But as the truth about his past began to surface, the same town that had once trusted him now found itself divided. Anger, fear, and disbelief simmered beneath the surface as residents began to question how much they had truly known about the man they had once admired. In the wake of Kathleen Savio's exhumation and the shocking findings from the second autopsy, Drew's calm exterior started to crack. The media attention surrounding the case intensified, and the town, once a peaceful suburban haven, became a battleground of public opinion. For some, Drew was still a hero. For others, he was a murderer hiding behind a badge. As the investigation unfolded, Drew's behavior became increasingly erratic. At first, he tried to maintain his composure, shrugging off the growing suspicions with his usual bravado. But when the cameras started to get closer, his confidence began to fray. He no longer smiled for the reporters. Instead, he glared, his responses growing more clipped and defensive with each interview. "You think I did it, don't you?" Drew snapped at one reporter, his voice rising in frustration. "I didn't kill Kathleen, and I didn't kill Stacy either." But the public wasn't buying it. Residents who had once seen Drew as a pillar of the community began to whisper behind his back, and those whispers grew louder every day. One by one, neighbors who had long supported him began to speak out. "He was always a bit too controlling, you know," said one neighbor who had lived next door to Drew for years. "But I never thought he was capable of this. The way he acted after Stacy went missing, it was like he didn't even care." The more people came forward with their doubts, the more Drew's defense seemed to crumble. A neighbor named Joan recalled an argument she had overheard between Drew and Stacy the night before she disappeared. "It wasn't just a little fight," Joan said. "It was loud, and there was something in his voice. It wasn't just frustration. It was something darker." By the end of the month, Drew had become the town pariah. Even those who had previously defended him began to second-guess their allegiance. "I didn't want to believe it," said another former supporter, a local store owner. "But now, with everything coming out about Kathleen, I'm not sure anymore." The final straw came when Thomas Morphy, Drew's own stepbrother, confessed to helping Drew move the blue barrel. The barrel, which had been seen in Drew's garage the night Stacy vanished, became a symbol of suspicion. Thomas's chilling revelation sent shockwaves through the community, especially when he admitted he had never known what was inside the barrel, only that Drew had seemed desperate to get rid of it. "I didn't ask any questions," Thomas said in his statement to investigators. "But looking back, I should have." The news of Thomas's involvement only fueled the fire. Drew's once solid defense, his trustworthy reputation, was now in tatters. The truth, long buried beneath layers of deception, was clawing its way to the surface. For Drew, the reality of the situation began to set in. His carefully curated image as a devoted husband, father, and public servant had shattered. Neighbors who once smiled at him now avoided eye contact. Friends turned into strangers. Even those in his own family began to question his role in the disappearances of both Kathleen and Stacy. Yet Drew remained unshaken in his resolve. "I am innocent," he repeated over and over, as though the mantra could somehow make it true. He had no intention of backing down, no intention of giving up his fight. But as each new piece of evidence came to light, Drew's world continued to unravel. The town that had once supported him now watched, not with admiration, but with suspicion. The whispers that had begun as small ripples of doubt now grew into waves of certainty. People had started to wonder, how could they have been so blind? And as the police investigation into Stacy's disappearance intensified, the town of Bolingbrook held its collective breath, waiting for the truth to finally come crashing down on the man who had once been its hero. The circus that had been building around Drew Peterson since Stacy's disappearance reached a boiling point. Bolingbrook, Illinois, a small town where neighbors once exchanged pleasantries over the fence, was now divided in two. One half believed Drew, a respected police officer, was the victim of a smear campaign. The other half, growing in number each day, was convinced that Drew was hiding something much darker than anyone could have imagined. The media, once so eager to give him the benefit of the doubt, had started to turn against him. Drew's every move was captured by cameras, his every word analyzed for signs of guilt or innocence. He had become the center of a national media frenzy, a spectacle that no one could look away from. At first, Drew seemed to relish the attention. He was used to the spotlight after all. As a police sergeant, he had been in charge of many investigations, often playing the role of the calm, rational authority figure. But now, instead of controlling the narrative, Drew found himself at its mercy. His cocky demeanor, which had once worked in his favor, was now beginning to rub people the wrong way. In an attempt to assert his innocence, Drew granted a series of interviews to local and national news outlets. On camera, he was smooth, his words carefully chosen, but there was something off in his delivery. The more he spoke, the more his behavior seemed disconnected from the gravity of the situation. "I didn't kill anyone," he insisted in one interview. "I'm a victim here. Stacy left me. She took off. What do you want me to say?" His lack of emotion seemed out of place. When reporters pressed him, asking about the blue barrel seen in his garage, his expression grew cold. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied, his voice tight. "You're making something out of nothing." But Drew's attempts to play the victim were falling flat. The public's patience was wearing thin, and his repeated statements about being misunderstood were only making him look more guilty. The coldness with which he talked about Stacy's disappearance, combined with his flippant response to Kathleen's exhumation, created a chilling image of a man who was either completely disconnected from reality, or worse, hiding something far darker. His behavior only intensified the media's scrutiny. He had once been the picture of authority, the trusted figure in a uniform. Now every movement, every gesture seemed to scream that he was trying to control the situation in a way that felt inauthentic and unsettling. At a press conference, when asked about his relationship with Kathleen, Drew's response was nothing short of bizarre. "She was a difficult woman," he said, his face stoic. "But that doesn't mean I killed her." The reporters exchanged uneasy glances as Drew continued. "I loved her, I really did, but she was difficult." The town that had once admired him now watched in disbelief as Drew's public persona unraveled. A local barber who had cut Drew's hair for years shared his thoughts with a reporter. "I always thought he was a good guy, you know? But after all this, I don't know anymore. There's just something about the way he's acting that doesn't sit right." Even Drew's own friends started to pull away. The men who had once supported him in every police-related matter now found themselves questioning his involvement in both Kathleen's death and Stacy's disappearance. Their loyalties, once firm, began to crack. A few days later, an anonymous tip came through, alleging that Drew had used police resources to track Stacy's movements before her disappearance. It was a small detail, but it was enough to shift the balance in the investigation. Drew, who had once been a respected member of the police force, was now suspected of using his authority to cover his tracks. In response, Drew only doubled down on his narrative of being a victim of circumstance. "I've done nothing wrong," he said in one final interview, his voice now defensive. "I didn't kill anyone, and I won't stand here and let people accuse me without proof." But as the days passed, the proof began to mount. Investigators, now more determined than ever, were piecing together a web of inconsistencies in Drew's story. The public's opinion of him shifted further, and what had once been a small-town mystery had now turned into a national scandal. As the media circus continued to swirl around him, Drew's attempts to maintain control were slipping away. And with every new revelation, the image of the charming police officer who had once been a hero seemed to fade further into the past. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as the trial of Drew Peterson, accused of murdering his third wife, Kathleen Savio, began. The weight of the case rested not only on the questions of guilt or innocence, but on the years of public suspicion, media frenzy, and the haunting silence surrounding the disappearance of his fourth wife, Stacy. As Drew sat at the defendant's table, his usually confident demeanor was absent. The polished, smug exterior that had carried him through public interviews was replaced with a quiet intensity, his eyes shifting nervously from side to side. His once supportive community, now a sea of skepticism, filled the gallery. Every eye was on him, judging, scrutinizing, waiting for him to crack. The prosecution opened with a devastating statement. "This isn't just about Kathleen Savio," the lead prosecutor Andrea Lynn said. "This is about the pattern of control, manipulation, and violence that defined Drew Peterson's relationships, ultimately leading to the death of Kathleen and the disappearance of Stacy." Her voice was firm, unwavering, as she set the stage for what would be a relentless pursuit of justice. Key to the prosecution's case was the forensic evidence that had been uncovered during the exhumation of Kathleen's body. Dr. Larry Blum, the forensic pathologist who had re-examined Kathleen's remains, took the stand and described the injuries that pointed unmistakably to foul play. Kathleen's wounds were inconsistent with an accidental fall, Dr. Blum testified. She was struck and held down. The evidence suggests that she fought for her life. The defense tried to discredit the findings, attempting to argue that the injuries could have been caused by a fall or some other accident. But with the detailed photographs of Kathleen's bruised and battered body displayed for the jury to see, the defense's attempts at minimizing the severity of the crime felt hollow. Drew's earlier insistence that her death had been an accident now seemed increasingly untenable. As the trial progressed, the prosecution presented a shocking piece of evidence: letters from Kathleen written in the months leading up to her death. In one, Kathleen wrote to a close friend, "If I ever die, don't believe it was an accident. Drew will make it look that way." The letter was haunting in its forewarning, chilling to everyone in the courtroom, especially as it mirrored the events that were now unfolding. Then came the testimony from Stacy's sister, Cassandra Cales. With tears in her eyes, she spoke of the fear Stacy had expressed to her about Drew. She recounted Stacy's words. "He killed Kathleen. I'm scared. He's going to kill me too if I try to leave." Her voice cracked with emotion as she described the terror in Stacy's eyes. "She knew," Cassandra said. "Stacy knew what Drew was capable of." Drew's defense team tried to counter this with their own testimony, claiming that there was no direct evidence linking him to Kathleen's murder and that Stacy's disappearance could have been a result of voluntary flight, not foul play. They painted Drew as a man who had been the victim of a media witch hunt, a grieving husband whose actions had been misinterpreted. But the prosecution's case continued to chip away at the defense's arguments. They brought in a former police colleague of Drew's, who revealed that Drew had misused his position in the department to gather information on his wives and track their movements. This was the most damning piece of evidence yet, a pattern of control that spanned both Kathleen and Stacy's relationships with Drew. As the final arguments began, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Drew's lawyers attempted to maintain the facade of a loving father and husband, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the jury wasn't buying it. They were seeing a man who had manipulated and controlled those around him to maintain his power, a man who had a deadly history of violence lurking beneath his calm exterior. In a final, unexpected twist, the prosecution called Drew's ex-wife, Carol Brown, to the stand. Carol, who had divorced Drew years earlier, spoke candidly about their tumultuous marriage. "He was always possessive," she said. "He didn't believe in letting me have a life of my own. If I wanted to go out with friends, he would make it difficult. He always had to be in control." Her testimony was the final nail in the coffin. Drew's image as a calm, reasonable man crumbled in front of the jury's eyes. The courtroom fell silent as the closing statements were made. Drew sat still, his face unreadable, but the weight of the case was clear. The evidence against him was mounting, and the prosecution had made their case. It was now up to the jury to decide if Drew Peterson was the man responsible for Kathleen Savio's death, and whether the silence that had surrounded Stacy's disappearance would soon be shattered by the truth. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension as Judge Edward J. Bermila stood up and addressed the court. Drew Peterson sat in the defendant's chair, his face pale, his eyes fixed ahead. His once proud posture had slumped, a clear sign of the pressure bearing down on him. After months of testimony, days of grueling cross-examinations, and endless media coverage, the moment had finally arrived. The sentencing. The jury had deliberated for hours, but their decision was clear. Drew Peterson was found guilty of the murder of his third wife, Kathleen Savio. It was a moment that felt like an eternity to those who had followed the case. For Kathleen's family, who had waited for justice for so many years, the verdict was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The long fight to have her death reconsidered had led them to this point, and they could finally exhale, knowing the truth had come to light. Drew's legal team had made one last attempt to avoid this moment. They had painted him as a misunderstood man, wronged by the system, the media, and even his own family. They called for a lesser sentence, urging the court to consider his long service as a police officer, his role as a father, and his apparent lack of remorse. They argued that Drew was not the violent killer the prosecution had made him out to be, but rather, he was a man who had been trapped in a bad marriage, unable to find a way out. But the courtroom wasn't moved. Drew's manipulations, his arrogance, and his chilling indifference to the pain he had caused were impossible to ignore. The jury had seen through the facade he had carefully crafted, the man who had once seemed so charming, so in control. The truth had finally surfaced, through forensic evidence, the testimony of his ex-wife, and the haunting words of Stacy's sister, Cassandra Cales. As Judge Bermila read the sentence, his voice was firm and resolute. "Drew Peterson, you are hereby sentenced to 38 years in prison for the murder of Kathleen Savio. You are to serve this sentence without the possibility of parole." The words struck like a hammer, the sound of justice finally ringing out. Kathleen's family, seated in the front rows, could not contain their emotions. Tears flowed freely down their faces as they turned to one another, their quiet relief overshadowed by the years of grief they had endured. Susan Doman, Kathleen's sister, held her head high as she wiped away tears. For her, this moment was not just about the conviction. It was about a sister lost far too soon, a sister who had been silenced by the very man who had vowed to protect her. Drew sat motionless, his face betraying nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't show any emotion. His lips remained pressed tightly together, his eyes fixed forward. Even in the face of this life-altering sentence, Drew Peterson remained the same cold, detached figure he had always been, a man who felt no remorse, no regret, only the bitter sting of defeat. But while the sentence was the end of one chapter, it was not the end of the story. Stacy Peterson's disappearance remained unsolved. Drew was now convicted of killing Kathleen, but the haunting question of what happened to Stacy lingered in the minds of everyone involved. Her body had never been found, and her family's quest for closure was far from over. The media, which had once followed Drew like a moth to a flame, now turned their attention back to the case that had initially been overshadowed by his conviction. Stacy's family had already begun their push for new investigations, a renewed search for their beloved daughter and sister. "We won't stop," Cassandra said in an interview after the trial. "We need to know where she is. We need the truth, just like we got for Kathleen." Drew Peterson was escorted out of the courtroom by guards, his face still a mask of indifference. As he was led away to begin his prison sentence, the crowd outside the courthouse erupted in cheers. It was a moment of justice, but it was also a reminder of the power of truth. a truth that had taken far too long to reveal itself. For those who had fought so hard to uncover it, the battle was far from over. But today, at least, there was a sense of closure. The first chapter of Drew Peterson's reckoning had been written. The trial was over, but for Cassandra Cales, the fight was far from finished. While Drew Peterson sat behind bars, sentenced to 38 years for the murder of Kathleen Savio, the haunting question of what had happened to her sister Stacy remained unanswered. The world had witnessed the trial and the conviction, but Cassandra's heart still ached with the knowledge that her sister's body had never been found, and that the truth about Stacy's disappearance had yet to fully unfold. Every day, Cassandra's resolve grew stronger. She had never allowed herself to rest, to move on until Stacy was brought home. Despite Drew's conviction, Cassandra refused to let go of the feeling that there was still more to uncover, more that could be done. She couldn't accept the idea that Stacy's fate would be left in limbo, her disappearance reduced to a mere footnote in the story of Drew's crimes. "The case isn't over for me," Cassandra said in a quiet, determined voice during an interview with reporters. "I won't stop until I know what happened to her, until I bring my sister home." The investigation into Stacy's disappearance had gone cold over the years, despite Cassandra's tireless efforts to push for answers. The police had conducted searches, followed leads, but every effort had ended in frustration. Stacy's friends and family had held out hope that one day the truth would emerge, but as time passed, the fear of that truth becoming a forgotten tragedy gnawed at them all. Cassandra knew this fight wouldn't be easy. She had already seen how the justice system had failed her sister. After all, Drew had never been truly held accountable for his role in Stacy's disappearance. Until the conviction for Kathleen's murder, he had remained free, unpunished. Cassandra had witnessed firsthand the toll this took on her family. The pain of never knowing was unbearable, and every year that passed felt like a year stolen from their lives. Determined to change the outcome, Cassandra continued to speak publicly, using every opportunity to keep Stacy's name in the media. She worked tirelessly with private investigators, gathering what little evidence they could. She pushed for the reopening of Stacy's case, despite the challenges. There were new leads, new questions to be asked, and Cassandra was not going to rest until she had them. "I don't care if it takes 1 year, 5 years, or 10, she said during a memorial event for Stacy. "I will fight until I know what happened to her. This isn't just about justice for my sister. It's about bringing closure to my family, to all of us who are still waiting for her." But the pain wasn't just in the search. Every public appearance, every plea for information, was a reminder of what had been lost. At the same time, it was a way for Cassandra to stay connected to her sister, to keep her memory alive. The photograph of Stacy that hung in Cassandra's living room, a reminder of the young woman full of life, a mother, a daughter, a sister, was a constant in her life. The laughter, the warmth, the light that Stacy brought into the world was still there, even in the face of such unspeakable pain. Yet, as Cassandra moved forward, her mission began to gather strength. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The public's attention shifted back to Stacy's case, and more people than ever before began to demand answers. The media, once fixated on Drew's trial, now turned its focus on the missing woman whose case had never truly been solved. The pressure on law enforcement grew. Private detectives re-examined old evidence, combing through the investigation with fresh eyes, while experts in criminal psychology delved into Drew's past. Even after Drew's conviction, there was an undercurrent of suspicion about his involvement in Stacy's disappearance. Many couldn't shake the feeling that he had not acted alone in whatever happened to her. Cassandra didn't know when, but she knew that eventually the truth would come out. It always did. And when it did, she would be there at the front lines, demanding justice for Stacy, as she had always done. "I won't stop," she said firmly, wiping away a tear, "because my sister deserves to be found." What do you think of Drew Peterson's case and the relentless pursuit of justice by Cassandra Cales? Do you believe we will ever uncover the truth about Stacy Peterson's disappearance? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below.